Thank you very much, and I'm very grateful for the organizers for giving me this presentation, this opportunity to present on this work. I'm going to talk from the point of view of Monte Carlo user, because I'm basically 100% a clinical physicist, and I'm hoping to convince you that Monte Carlo can be a very powerful tool in our day-to-day work in the clinic. I'm going to talk about source 20 of DOSXYZ NRC, which I have developed with Giulio Lobo several years ago, and is now publicly available. And it has been used for Monte Carlo-based QA for more than 2,500 VMAT patients in Vancouver. We have a long history because VMAT has been developed there by Carl Otto, and we got a very early start on this program. Of course, it was a learning curve. Initially, we've done a lot of measurements and phantom validations, and then as we gained confidence, Monte Carlo started to have a more and more prominent role in our QA process. And we are literally treating all curative treatments with VMAT now because it's extremely efficient and extremely powerful in terms of delivering conformal dose and sparing the healthy organs. And here we have some of the main sites for which we are using it. So as I said, at the core of this VMAT QA system is Source 20, which we have developed for the purpose of 4D Monte Carlo simulations of continuously variable beam configurations. So it can deal with any dynamic degree of freedom, whether existing or yet to be invented, it will deal with it. We published in 2010, and if you want to look up this paper in PMB, the first time when it was incorporated in BEAM and DOSXYZ was in 2011. In DOSXYZ, we introduced sources 20 and 21. Source 20 starts from a phase space, and source 21 doesn't use any phase space at all. I mean, both of them can use share libraries, but the share library used by source 21 is like source 9, a full Linux simulation, delivering particles for the DOSXYZ simulation. Also, they work in conjunction with synchronized component modules. One for JAWS, one for the Electa MLC, one sync VMLCs for the Millennium MLC, and now available in BEAM 2013, we also have sync HDMLC, which is for the TrueBeam HDMLC or for the Novalis HDMLC. Unique to these sources is the synchronization through a randomly sampled time scale, or MU scale rather, between the motion in the BEAM share library, for example, JAWS and MLC, and the motion in the DOSXYZ geometry. So basically, in source 20, you start from a phase space typically above the JAWS, and you can either have no phase space downstream at all if you want, or you can score a phase space anywhere you want and use it further. The way it works is that once a particle passes through a sync type component module, it acquires an MU index and it selects a specific aperture, and all the sync modules downstream then are given the same MU index and therefore the corresponding aperture. Furthermore, DOSXYZ reads this MU index and selects the appropriate collimator angle, gantry angle, the parameters in the exim corresponding to gantry angle, collimator angle, couch angle. And all of these degrees of freedom can be static or dynamic. You can make an input file as complicated as you want. For example, the most complicated exim file we've made had about 30,000 control points, and it came from a trajectory log file from a TrueBeam Linux in which all the degrees of freedom were in motion. I'll show an example. later. So some of you have seen this in other presentation of mine, but I like to show you for how Monte Carlo can model the MLC. Varian has come up many years ago with MLC leaf sequence that allows you to obtain the photo of Einstein on a film in solid water. But if you run the same MLC file in Eclipse, you get a blurred image because, as we know, the treatment planning system uses an average transmission and doesn't account for the detailed tongue and groove geometry. But in Monte Carlo, whether you do it with Jeff Sieber's particle DMLC code or with Sync VMLC, you'll get a very accurate image. An example of what you can do with Source 20, first of all, no matter how complicated the plan is, we do it in one simulation. So this, here we have 3 non-coplanar arcs for a lung treatment, and we simulated that in one run on the cylindrical phantom, because we always run, I mean, we can run it on the patient CT, and we do it upon request from the oncologist, but typically for our QA, we do it on the cylindrical phantom because we do measurements as well. So here you have the 2 tumors. This person had 2 PTVs in the lung, and it's probably hard for you to see, but in the region of interest, which is the volume of the chamber, the mean dose was within 0.5%. And this is typical of our simulations. Another interesting thing that you can do is, even if you do a static field IMRT, you can still use Source 20 to do it in a single simulation. On the top left, you have the Eclipse dose distribution. On the top right, you have the Monte Carlo dose distribution simulated field by field, so 5 separate simulations, and then the dose was added together. But at the bottom, in the bottom panel, you have the Monte Carlo simulation done with Source 20, and if you look carefully, there's only one field. It is as if it's an arc, but when we build the EXIM file from the DICOM file, we got the correct geometry of this plan. So our colleagues who use Monte Carlo in the QA process don't know anything about Monte Carlo, and because our entire process is scripted and it's automatic. So basically they just export the DICOM files of the plan to the cluster, and they type the patient ID, and that starts the process. So that extracts from the DICOM file all the information required for the EXIM files for BEAM and DOSXYZ, runs BEAM and DOSXYZ, and then in the end transforms again the raw 3D dose into an absolute dose, and embeds that into another DICOM file, which can be brought back into Eclipse for the purpose of side-by-side comparison, or taking advantage of all the tools available there, such as dose volume histograms, plan subtractions, and so on. But more recently, we have provided enhanced capabilities for Source 20 to address specific challenges presented by true beam simulations. Specifically, the most important one is that the full LINAC model is unavailable. The manufacturer does not make it available anymore. And also, the first generation IEA phase space files that they published were scored on a cylindrical surface. There's no time now to go back to the history of it. Frank will be able to tell you more about it. He was a leader of a whole movement in which we try to talk to Varian about the, it'll be important and useful for us to have access to this model. But at the same time, we thought that there's stuff to do on our end, on the Monte Carlo end, and indeed, we have redesigned Source 20 to enable it to dynamically load a beam library at runtime and preserve synchronization, even when starting from a phase space. So now here's, so think about this. This is the tricky part. You have a phase space above the jaws, but you want to use DOSXYZ to call a beam share library consisting of the jaws and the MLC, which are dynamic. So, of course, you can rewrite the whole thing from scratch if you want, but our strategy in order to make it easily available to any Beam and DOS-XYZ user was to make as little change as possible. And the simplest way to go about it was to make DOS-XYZ read that phase space above the JAWS. So actually it's DOS-XYZ that reads that phase space and gives particles to Beam. Beam runs them and returns them to DOS-XYZ. Why is that? Because DOS-XYZ has to know how many times to recycle a particle based on the number of histories requested by the user. So because we didn't want to rewrite Beam and DOS-XYZ for them to communicate with each other, we are making Beam the silent partner, and DOS-XYZ controls the whole process because DOS-XYZ knows how many histories to run. But how does it know how many histories to run since we have dynamic MLC and dynamic JAWS? Well, just like in the old artillery, hundreds of years ago, you had to shoot a few cannons just to see where they go, and then you would, zone in and do it more precisely. At the beginning of a run, we run about 1 million particles in what we call a calibration run to establish a survival ratio, which tells us how many particles will be killed by the JAWS and the MLC. And that's how DOS-XYZ knows how many times to recycle a particle. Moreover, we have enabled Beam and DOS-XYZ to use the actual Z coordinate of each particle. And if you go into a BeamDP and you have to, I mean, we haven't made this change because that's the NRC task. But if you go there and select to display X and Z and take one of these curved variant phase spaces, you'll see that it's there. So the Z coordinate is read correctly. But since we were there, we didn't stop at just the Z coordinate, and we found it useful to actually enable both Beam and DOS-XYZ to read and write 4D phase spaces. And what do I mean by a 4D phase space? 3D because it has X, Y, Z for each particle, but also it has the MU index for each particle. So that's why it's a 4D phase space. So you can take a dynamic JAWS, dynamic MLC, score a phase space, and that time information will be preserved. You can put it in your computer and use it next week in DOS-XYZ, and you'll get the correct result because the time information is written for each particle. We have extensively tested this new version of Source 20, and for jaw tracking, non-coplanar, multiple arc VMAT for standards and flattening filter-free photon beams, and most of it has been already released in Beam NRC of March 2013, and later developments regarding 4D phase spaces are currently being considered by the NRC for the next code release. And here I'm just going to show you that it's useful indeed to have jaw tracking. This worked earlier, so it should work. Here again, it's that case of the two tumors. And because of the beam's eye view, as the gantry rotates around the patient, it is really useful to be able to change the shape of this rectangle defined by the JAWS to minimize the leakage through that. So here's the what I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure this was the first Monte Carlo simulation of a VMAT true beam plan with jaw tracking. And remember, before the sync modules, it would have been impossible to do something that has dynamic jaw tracking and dynamic MLC. Previously, we were able to do something with just one dynamic, but you can have as many as you want now. And we actually have a recipe to turn any component module into a dynamic one. If somebody ever comes up with some kind of electronic filter somehow, we'll probably be able to make the dynamic as well. Here's going to the HD MLC that I told you about. A very complicated spine SBRT plan in which, if you look there, the PTV is surrounding the spinal cord, and yet even the planning system did a very good job by keeping the dose low right on the spinal cord. And here's on the cylindrical phantom, Eclipse and Monte Carlo side by side. So it's very reassuring in the clinic that you see that the dose calculation is correct, confirmed by a completely independent method. Here's a profile comparison, Eclipse and Monte Carlo, and here's Monte Carlo versus GAF-chronic film. GAF-chronic film is the noisier one. And another case in which we have an SBRT lung with 3 PTVs, very complicated case. And again, very good agreement with measurements as well. But where Source 20 really shines is when you allow all degrees of freedom to be present at the same time while the beam is on. And that's possible in the true beam developer mode, which is not a clinical mode, but it allows you to have the beam on while not only that the gantry and the collimator and the jaws move independently, but also you can have couch rotation and translation and in any direction. So here's an example. For each control point, all these parameters are different. I mean, Source 20 can already calculate that, but with my colleagues, we developed a little tool that generates the required beam and DOS-XYZ XIMP files starting from the XML files that are required by the developer mode. And here's an example of Monte Carlo versus GAF-chromic film for a beam delivery that included collimator rotation, couch translation, lateral and longitudinal, and couch rotation. And of course, so far we've talked about pre-treatment dose verification, which is a clinical mainstay. But of course, there is growing interest in the use of QA methods that are more relevant to the actual patient treatment. We want to be able to provide in vivo dosimetry. Well, you know, this term is a little bit used abusively. I don't mean like having instruments inside the patient, but having, for example, EPID dose information after the beam has passed through the patient. So I'm talking about it in this sense. In collaboration with Boyd McCurdy in Manitoba, we have developed and validated general research tool that performs Monte Carlo simulations for VMAT, simultaneously provided dose deposition in both the patient CT and any type of planar entrance or exit detector system. They had the compass detector that can be attached to the gantry, and it's an independent beam check. And again, I want to make it very clear that conceptually this is nothing new because people have been using EPID in vivo dosimetry for many years, and Frank Verhagen has been a pioneer in this field. This is just something that we are putting in front of the general beam and DOS-XYZ user. So it's something which will be very easy to implement by all users. This new framework amounts to adding a measurement component to a Monte Carlo simulation. For example, in the US, they wouldn't be able to just do Monte Carlo because they cannot bill the insurance company, or in Europe, they have a legal requirement to have a measurement component. So that could qualify for that and yet have the advantage of Monte Carlo. And you know, you can do pre-treatment QA as much as you want, but then if you do a wrong move or think about something like the New York incident, something that happens down in the 5th fraction. So obviously, we need to do more than just pre-treatment QA on a phantom. We need to see what happens with the patient there. And here's an example from our 2013 paper of EPID Monte Carlo and measured after it, at the same time we had dose in the patient. And now we've done that part through brute force. Because at that time we didn't have the 4D phase spaces available. So the way they wanted EPID information control point by control point. So they literally had to do 178 different simulations for, so that's not satisfactory. Moreover, unlike Eclipse, which thinks of a VMAT beam as 178 separate beams, Source 20 thinks of it as a continuous simulation. So it's been much nicer to do something continuously. So we came up with this idea of using the 4D phase spaces, namely the one which is output by DOS-XYZ. So again, this is not the first time it has been attempted. Emiliano Spezzi has had a paper more than 10 years ago, but he acquired an exit phase space in DOSXYZ, but it was a planar phase space in the XPHSP format. This one is in IEA format, so it is on all 6 sides surrounding the patient CT. And it's 4D because it has the MU information. So I'm going to show you this animation. On the very far left is basically the phase space as it exits the LINAC. In the middle, we have this phase space as it exits the patients in DOSXYZ coordinates. And then on the right, the same phase space in the middle, but not in DOSXYZ coordinates, but in beam coordinates. Because if I want to take it further and simulate it into the EPID, I will want it to be in beam coordinates, obviously, because EPID is fixed with the beam, so it's just a simple simulation. And this is how it looks like. Just to show you that we have control over the MU index, I have colored the particles with MU index between 0 and 0.5 in red, and the one from 0.5 to 1 in blue. Let's see how it looks like. I think I talked too much and it decided, okay, good. So this is that same VMAT plan with jaw tracking. And as you can, but if you try to imagine geometrically, it does look very weird in beam coordinates. But that's how it is. So these are all the particles, including the backscattered ones. I'm just rotating to give you an idea that it's a spatial thing. And see, it looks like the one that entered, came out of the LINAC, but of course it has all the scatter due to the beam going through the patient. Here, just to have a visual, because we talked about Einstein's photo, I try to acquire a 4D phase space in a box of air. So I have a phantom of air, and I'm acquiring a phase space as the beam exits this phantom, and I'm shooting the beams through the main diagonal of the cube. So I have Einstein's photo accumulating. And because these are particles, it's a phase space view, you don't see it very clearly, but then when I take this phase space and I slam it into, the phase space is on at the top, into the EPID, and I'm doing it control point by control point, we have the Monte Carlo simulation of the cumulative EPID dose, and here we have the actual EPID image acquired in cine mode. And of course, Monte Carlo is noisier because I really did this control point by control point, so every 5 MU, so I just use a few million particles for each. But it's a very fast simulation because the particles are already close to the EPID, right? Except the backscattered one, which won't even go towards the EPID. So it's like a 1 minute simulation for a billion particles. So in conclusion, we have successfully used Source 20 in a clinical setting, and it's now part of the standard beam and DOSXYZ distribution. And as far as I know, it's in various stages of implementation at about 40 other institutions. And I hope there are more, but now it's in the public domain, so I don't have, this is just based on the emails I have. And when I say, I put there between quote marks, stages of implementation, because some people are just trying it out, but some people, like Lund University Hospital, they are doing exactly what we do. It's their routine QA. They've done hundreds of cases. There's also a clinic in Japan, which is also very advanced, doing it routinely. And we have introduced enhanced capabilities to address the current absence of a model release for TrueBeam. And actually, I don't have to talk about it now, but at AAPM, I have a presentation about how to go about absolute dose for TrueBeam, since we don't have the chamber model. And I've been a champion of since 2005 of using the backscatter to the monitor chamber to convert. But luckily, there is a file on the LINAC which gives us that information. And in the following presentation of Emily Heath, you'll see another example of synchronized simulations. We are in full swing with developing a framework using 40-phase spaces for efficient simulations of for in vivo QA. And I would like to acknowledge my friends from the Monte Carlo community with whom I've had many important discussions over these years during which I've done this work, and my colleagues from Vancouver, and these are my sources of funding. Thank you very much. As I said, it was a learning curve. We've done the few hundred patients, probably 200 or 300, all with measurements and Monte Carlo at the same time. But now we are doing at least 5 a day. So it would be physically impossible to offer this advanced technique to pay. We would have to tell them that we cannot offer it to them. So doing it by Monte Carlo and dropping measurements is a way that allowed us to move forward. However, we still measure every 50th patient, which happens at least once a week, about once a week, with a chamber in the cylindrical phantom. Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't have time to mention, but we acquired the Dynalog files in every fraction, and which are the files written by the LINAC during the actual delivery with the patient, and we rerun the Dynalog file from the first fraction into the Monte Carlo. And you know, I must say, I mean, there's a whole discussion about whether you do patient-specific QA and process-specific QA. I think we have to do both, but we have strengthened enormously the machine QA to be able to release this requirement to have every patient measured.
What is the calculation time and
the calculation time, so our infrastructure is a cluster of 8 servers of 32 cores each. So when I send the job in the queue, in the Condor queue, it appears that it's sent on 256 nodes. And the entire execution of our automated script from the DICOM files to the final gamma 3D gamma between Eclipse and Monte Carlo takes 20 minutes. So the actual beam simulation through the jaws is about 2 minutes, and the source 20 takes about 15 minutes, and that includes the MLC share library. And again, it was a big struggle. We had a local cluster. We took care of it however we could, but then we demonstrated to the radiation therapy program that this is an asset of the department, just like a LINAC or a treatment planning system, and they have to support it. And now they support it officially, so we don't have to worry about it. And it cost about $100,000, but that included the installation, which was outsourced to IBM. We've done many dose distribution in the patient, but we don't do that routinely because, for example, in lung, there are already differences between AAA and Monte Carlo, and we wouldn't know if it's due to the algorithm or because something went wrong. So I'm talking here strictly about QA, about a constancy process. So it's not a dosimetric study, it's a constancy check of the integrity of the process. So that's why we are doing it routinely on the cylindrical water equivalent phantom. And yes, we want to acquire to use the EPID to predict the EPID through the patient. So we will have to do. Yes, but when we do it with the EPID, we'll do it with the patient.
And when do you know when you would want to deliver
That actually happened once, and so no, in 2,500 cases, it happened once, and it was due to a very weird situation in which somebody in a different center, because we are a 6-center networked institution, somebody in a different center changed the dosimetric leaf gap, and inadvertently it affected all the centers. The chamber measurement passed marginally with a 3% difference, but the Monte Carlo gamma was about 50%, so we knew that something was wrong and we investigated.